A grocery cashier calls security on Shaquille O'Neal for paying for a struggling mother's groceries. What starts as a simple act of kindness spirals into a shocking confrontation that exposes deep-rooted bias. As tensions rise and cameras roll, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. But when Shaq turns the moment into something bigger, no one sees what's coming next. One mistake, one viral moment, one lesson that changes everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The midday sun poured through the glass windows of Miller's Fresh Market, casting soft light over the aisles lined with fresh produce and neatly stocked shelves. It was an ordinary day, cash registers beeping, shopping carts rolling, customers moving with purpose. The scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the faint chill of the dairy section, creating that familiar grocery store atmosphere. Among the shoppers, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, towered over everyone. Dressed in a simple black hoodie, basketball shorts, and crisp white sneakers, Shaq moved through the aisles like any regular customer. His presence was hard to ignore, but he wasn't there for attention. He wasn't a celebrity today, just a man grabbing essentials. He reached for a family-sized cereal box, tossing it into his cart alongside orange juice, eggs, and a few protein bars. He hummed softly, a relaxed energy surrounding him as he moved past the snack aisle, barely noticing the occasional whispered recognition from fellow shoppers. Then, near the checkout lanes, something caught his attention. A young woman in her early 30s, standing with two kids, one no older than 8, the other maybe 5. She was fumbling through her purse, her face tight with worry as she counted a small stack of crumpled dollar bills. Her name was Vanessa Carter, and she was trying to make every penny stretch. Shaq slowed his pace, casually rolling his cart to the side, watching as Vanessa bit her lip, glancing up at the screen displaying her total, $73.49. Her older son, Liam, tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, can we still get the peanut butter?" Vanessa forced a small smile, though her eyes were filled with exhaustion. "Let's see, baby." She exhaled and looked at the items in front of her, basic groceries. A gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a few apples, some pasta, and a small pack of chicken. Nothing extravagant, nothing unnecessary. Still, it was more than she could afford. The cashier, a teenage boy barely old enough to drive, waited patiently as Vanessa hesitated. Shaq had seen this moment before, too many times. He watched as Vanessa slowly slid the peanut butter off the belt, setting it aside. Then, she grabbed the apples. "We don't really need those," she murmured to her younger son, Noah, whose face fell. The boy didn't argue, but his tiny fingers curled into his sleeves. He had learned, at a painfully young age, what it meant when his mother said, "Maybe next time." Shaq's chest tightened. He had been that kid once. He had watched his mother, Lucille O'Neal, make impossible choices at grocery stores. He had felt the quiet shame of seeing her put things back while pretending he didn't care, and he wasn't about to stand there and let it happen again. Shaq pushed his cart forward, his deep voice breaking the tension. "Hey, put those back on the belt," he said casually, nodding toward the apples and peanut butter. Vanessa blinked, startled. She turned and tilted her head up, way up, until she realized who she was looking at. Her lips parted in surprise, but before she could react, Shaq tapped his card against the reader. "Everything's covered," he said, offering a small, reassuring smile. The screen flashed, approved. Vanessa's eyes widened. "Wait, no, I can't let you." Shaq waved a dismissive hand. "It's all good. I got it." Vanessa looked overwhelmed, torn between gratitude and discomfort. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You just did," Shaq said simply. Liam and Noah stared up at him in awe. "You're really Shaq," Liam blurted out. Shaq grinned. "I was last time I checked." Noah, still clutching his mother's sleeve, squinted up at the giant man. "Why are you so big?" Shaq laughed, a deep, warm rumble that made the cashier chuckle too. "Man, I ask myself that every day." Vanessa wiped at her eyes, sniffling quietly. "You don't understand how much this means to us." Shaq did understand, more than she could ever know, but not everyone in the store shared the moment's warmth. A few lanes over, Henry Lawson, a middle-aged cashier with a permanent scowl, had been watching, and he didn't like what he saw. Henry had worked at Miller's Fresh Market for over a decade. He didn't trust big displays of generosity. In his eyes, people didn't just step in and pay for strangers unless they had an agenda. And Shaquille O'Neal? To him, Shaq was just another rich man trying to look good. Henry leaned against his register, his sharp eyes narrowing. "This doesn't look right," he muttered under his breath. His co-worker, a young woman bagging groceries, glanced over. "What?" Henry shook his head. "Some guy, big guy, just walked up and paid for that lady's stuff, no questions asked." The bagger frowned. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Henry scoffed. "Or it's a scam." He wasn't sure what scam exactly, but his gut told him something was off. Rich people didn't just throw money around like that, not in his experience. And then something clicked in his mind. What if the card was stolen? Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced toward the store phone behind the counter, and without hesitation, he picked it up. Shaq was still chatting with Vanessa and her kids when a deep voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir." Shaq turned, expecting another fan or maybe a store manager coming over to say hello. Instead, he found a uniformed security officer walking toward him. The man, Officer Brad Mitchell, had a serious expression, his walk purposeful. Shaq's easy smile faded. "Is there a problem?" he asked, shifting slightly to put himself between Vanessa and the officer. Officer Mitchell's gaze flicked to Henry, who stood at his register with his arms crossed. "We received a report about a suspicious transaction at this register," the officer said. Vanessa tensed. "What? Suspicious?" Henry stepped forward, eyes locked on Shaq. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I can't just let someone waltz in, swipe a card, and—" Shaq raised an eyebrow. Now he understood. This wasn't about the transaction. This was about who was making it. The store had a billionaire standing in line paying for groceries. But to Henry, he was just another black man making a scene. The store grew uncomfortably quiet. Vanessa's hands clenched into fists. "This man just helped me, and you're acting like he—" Shaq exhaled slowly. "It's all right." Then, calmly, he looked at Officer Mitchell. "You want to check my ID, my bank statements? Call my accountant? Or are we going to skip the usual song and dance?" The officer paused. Henry, however, wasn't backing down. "I think it's best if we confirm the payment was legitimate before we—" Shaq shook his head, disappointed but not surprised. He had seen this before, too many times. And now, the real battle was about to begin. The quiet hum of Miller's Fresh Market was suddenly disrupted by an uneasy tension. Moments ago, the air had been filled with the casual rhythm of a normal afternoon. Shoppers moving in and out, carts rolling, receipts printing. But now, something unspoken but heavy settled over the checkout lanes. At the center of it all stood Henry Lawson, the cashier at Register 3. Henry had worked at Miller's for over a decade. In his own mind, he wasn't just a cashier. He was a gatekeeper, an enforcer of store policies, a man who believed that rules separated order from chaos. And right now, he was convinced something wasn't right. Henry had watched the whole thing unfold. The towering man in the black hoodie stepping in, swiping his card, casually paying for the woman's groceries. He had seen Vanessa's stunned gratitude and the way her kids had looked up in awe. And instead of seeing kindness, Henry saw a problem. Because in his world, people didn't just do things like that. Not without a reason, not without an angle. Henry had worked long enough to spot trouble when he saw it. And in his mind, trouble was often disguised as generosity. Maybe the card was stolen. Maybe this guy was trying to look good for social media. Maybe he was scamming the store. Henry didn't know for sure, but he wasn't about to let something suspicious slide past him. He squared his shoulders, fingers tightening around the edge of the register as he called out. "Sir," Henry said, his voice loud enough to make nearby shoppers glance over. "I need to verify that payment." Shaq, who had been sharing a lighthearted moment with Vanessa and her kids, turned his head slightly. His expression remained calm, but curious. "Verify?" he repeated. Henry crossed his arms, standing firm. Yeah, we have policies. Large transactions need verification. I need to see some ID. Vanessa, still holding her grocery bags, blinked in confusion. Wait, what? He literally just paid for my food. Henry barely looked at her. His focus was locked on Shaq. Shaq took a slow breath, exhaling through his nose. You think I used a fake card? Henry didn't flinch. I think I need to confirm the transaction was legitimate. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. He had been in this exact moment before. Not here, not in a grocery store, but in a million other places. Restaurants, luxury hotels, car dealerships. Places where people like Henry couldn't quite believe that a black man could have money without a catch. Henry tapped his fingers against the register. Waiting, Shaq tilted his head. All right, he said smoothly. How do you want to verify it? Henry reached for his register phone. We can call the card issuer and confirm the funds. At this, the energy in the store shifted. A few customers paused their shopping, watching in confusion. Some exchanged glances, whispering. A couple in their 60s frowned from the next lane, their hands frozen over their cart. A middle-aged woman, who had been watching the entire thing unfold near the produce section, shook her head. This is ridiculous, she muttered under her breath. Vanessa looked between Henry and Shaq, her face tightening with disbelief. She had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, treated like a burden. But now, watching someone like Shaq, someone who had just done something so selfless, be treated like a suspect, it made her blood boil. This is insane, Vanessa snapped, stepping forward. He literally just paid. What else do you need? Henry ignored her. His eyes never left Shaq. Shaq remained still, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slid out his black titanium American Express card. He held it up between his fingers. This is the same card I used, Shaq said. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something cold beneath it. Henry hesitated, eyeing the card. Shaq's voice didn't waver. Go ahead, call them. Henry swallowed but didn't move, because now he wasn't so sure. Now doubt was creeping in. A murmur spread through the store. People were watching, listening, judging. A man in his early 40s, standing in line at Register 5, shook his head. That's Shaquille O'Neal, dude, he muttered to his wife. The guy's worth hundreds of millions. What the hell is this guy even questioning? An older black woman near the bakery section folded her arms, her face tight with anger. This is how it always happens, she said under her breath. Even when you do good, they still look at you like you're guilty. A few feet away, a teenage boy named Jordan was holding up his phone. He had started recording the second Henry raised his voice. Because Jordan, he had seen too many stories like this online. And now, he was catching one in real time. Shaq hadn't moved. He still held out the card. Still waited. Henry's jaw clenched. He had expected Shaq to get angry, to push back, to give him a reason to justify his suspicions. But Shaq had done the worst thing possible. He had stayed calm, collected. And worst of all, he had let Henry's own bias expose itself. Finally, Henry exhaled through his nose, forcing a tight smile. Fine, he muttered. Forget it. The payment went through. Just, next time, give a little heads up before making big purchases. Shaq's eyes flickered. There it was. The attempt to backpedal without apologizing. To reclaim authority without admitting fault. Vanessa scoffed. Oh, so now it's fine? After humiliating him? Shaq, however, remained composed. He tucked his card back into his wallet, slipped it into his pocket, then gave Henry one last look. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was something far worse. It was disappointment. Then, without another word, Shaq turned and walked toward the exit. Vanessa and her kids followed close behind, still fuming. Jordan, the teenager filming, lowered his phone. His screen still showed the last 5 minutes of recorded footage. And he had a feeling. This wasn't going to stay just another bad customer service moment. Because what had just happened was bigger than this store. Bigger than one bad cashier. And Jordan knew exactly what to do next. Post it. As Shaq stepped out into the bright daylight, His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, checking the notification. The first few messages were from friends, already asking if he was okay. Then, another notification popped up, a Twitter link. He clicked it. And there, staring back at him, was the video, the one Jordan had uploaded. With the caption, "Shaquille O'Neal just got stopped for being too generous. Welcome to America." Shaq exhaled, staring at the video playing on the screen. The views were already climbing. The comments were already rolling in. And this was just getting started. Henry Lawson was not a man who backed down easily. Even as Shaquille O'Neal stood before him, towering, composed, and calmly watching his every move, Henry felt the sting of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe it was wounded pride. Maybe it was the uncomfortable realization that he had messed up, and now people were watching. Either way, he couldn't let this slide. He needed to reclaim control. And in Henry's world, when a situation didn't feel right, there was one solution. Call security. Henry's fingers clenched around the register phone. His pulse hammered as he punched in the familiar extension, 101, store security. A click, then a voice. Security. Mitchell speaking. Henry glanced toward Shaq, who was still standing by the register, now fully aware of what was happening. Henry's voice lowered, but his tone was clipped. "I need someone at checkout 3. Potential fraud situation. Large, suspicious transaction. The guy's getting aggressive." The words felt easy, effortless. He had used them before. Phrases that made it sound urgent, dangerous. And he knew exactly what kind of response it would trigger. Officer Brad Mitchell moved fast. Dressed in a stiff Navy security uniform, badge gleaming under the fluorescent store lights, he walked with a purposeful stride. Mitchell wasn't just another mall cop. He took his job seriously. He had spent years asserting authority, making sure people respected the rules. And now, he was heading toward trouble. Or at least, that's what Henry had led him to believe. As Mitchell turned the corner toward the registers, he scanned the crowd, searching for a disturbance. What he found was a 7-foot-tall black man standing completely still, arms relaxed, no aggression in sight. And yet his mind made a snap decision anyway. This is the problem. Mitchell didn't hesitate. His voice boomed over the checkout area. "Sir, I need you to step back." Shaq didn't move. His deep brown eyes met Mitchell's sharp, assessing gaze. The room stilled. Customers froze mid-checkout, eyes darting toward the sudden escalation. The buzz of casual conversations died. The only sound was the beeping of unattended registers and the low murmur of confusion spreading through the store. Mitchell squared his shoulders. "I said, step back." Shaq exhaled through his nose. Slow. Controlled. His voice remained steady. "Step back from what exactly?" Mitchell was already irritated. "We received a report about a disturbance at this register." Shaq lifted a brow. "And by disturbance, you mean paying for groceries?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. Henry, standing smugly behind his register, jumped in. "I told you. He paid for this lady's groceries with no warning, then got defensive when I asked for verification. This could be credit card fraud. Who just walks up and—" Vanessa, who had been silent in stunned disbelief until now, snapped. "Oh, come on," she cut in, stepping between Shaq and Henry. Her voice shook with rage. "The only thing this man did was help me, and now you're treating him like a criminal?" Mitchell barely spared her a glance. Henry waved a dismissive hand. "Ma'am, please step aside. This has nothing to do with you." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "Nothing to do with me? This is literally about me. If I had paid myself, you wouldn't have called security. You saw a black man paying and lost your mind." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. Some shoppers nodded. Others whispered. A few pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding situation. Mitchell noticed the cameras, but he didn't like backing down. The store was no longer a grocery store. It was now a stage, one where every single move mattered. Shaq, still calm, still watching, finally spoke again. "I'll ask one more time," he said, his voice deep, slow, deliberate. "What exactly do you need me to step back from?" Mitchell hesitated. This wasn't what he expected. He was used to authority being obeyed immediately, to people nervously scrambling to explain themselves. But this man? He wasn't flinching, wasn't angry, wasn't even raising his voice. And somehow that made it worse. A middle-aged woman near the floral section shook her head. This is disgusting. A man in a business suit crossed his arms. They should be thanking him, not harassing him. A teenage girl whispered to her mother. Mom, isn't that Shaq? People were choosing sides, and it was clear who was losing. Henry, still clinging to control, scoffed. Listen, if there's no problem, why don't we just see some ID? If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be an issue. Shaq finally turned fully toward him. And Henry? Henry felt something cold crawl down his spine. Shaq wasn't mad. He was disappointed. The way a teacher looks at a student who should have known better. And for the first time, Henry felt small. Mitchell, still standing firm, suddenly felt his radio buzz. Mitchell, status. He hesitated, because what was he going to say? Yeah, turns out I got called here for no reason. His gut twisted. This wasn't a security issue. This was a store employee using security to reinforce his own bias. And now? Now Mitchell was in the middle of it. Vanessa's voice cut through the air. Are you guys seriously going to keep this up? She snapped, shaking her head. He didn't steal. He didn't yell. He didn't do anything except help. So why is he the only person in this store being treated like a problem? More phones lifted. More whispers. And finally, Mitchell let out a slow breath. He turned to Henry. You called this in? Henry hesitated. I was just following store policy. Mitchell exhaled through his nose. Uh-huh. Then, without another word, he turned to Shaq. Sorry for the misunderstanding, he muttered, low enough that only Shaq could hear. Shaq held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Not a thank you. Just a quiet acknowledgement that Mitchell had finally seen the truth. Then Shaq turned and walked toward the exit. Vanessa and her kids followed, her hands still clenched in fists. The tension didn't leave the store immediately. Because the truth? It wasn't over yet. Not even close. Because outside these walls, something much bigger was happening. And by the time Henry realized what was coming, it would already be too late. The energy in Miller's Fresh Market had shifted completely. What had started as a simple act of kindness had escalated into a public confrontation, with Shaquille O'Neal standing at the center of it. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't causing a scene, but the scene had found him anyway. The checkout lanes had slowed, customers had stopped pretending to mind their business. Some whispered, some filmed, others just stared. And Shaq? Shaq was still calm, but calm did not mean complacent. Henry Lawson, the cashier who had started all of this, was still trying to reassert himself. He cleared his throat loudly, shifting behind his register as if that gave him some kind of advantage. Look, I don't know why you're making this such a big deal, Henry said, voice sharp. If there's no problem, just follow standard procedure. Show an ID and we'll be done here. Shaq exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. I already paid. Transaction went through. What are you really asking for? Henry folded his arms. I'm asking for basic cooperation. There it was. That word. Shaq had heard it too many times before. Cooperation. It was what people like Henry always said when they needed to justify why they were treating someone differently. And Shaq was done playing along. Officer Brad Mitchell stood a few feet away, arms crossed. He had already made up his mind about how this was going to end. Shaq could see it on his face. Mitchell wasn't interested in the truth. He wasn't interested in the fact that nothing illegal had happened here. He was interested in getting Shaq out of the store. And now, he was going to try. Mitchell adjusted his belt, then stepped forward, dropping his voice just enough to make it sound like a reasonable request. Sir, Mitchell said, I think it's best if you leave. Shaq's eyes flickered, not a reaction of anger, just disbelief at the predictability of it all. I should leave, Shaq repeated. Mitchell nodded. Look, you've made your point. There's no need to turn this into a bigger situation. Shaq let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You're acting like I'm the one making this a situation. Mitchell stiffened. Sir, I'm asking you to exit the store. Based on what? Shaq interrupted, his voice still calm. Mitchell hesitated, because he didn't actually have an answer. Henry, however, jumped in quickly. He's disrupting business, Henry said. Customers are uncomfortable. Shaq turned slightly, looking around at the other shoppers. Anybody uncomfortable? No one spoke. A woman near the frozen food section shook her head. A middle-aged man near the self-checkout muttered, "This is ridiculous." A teenage girl whispered to her friend, "This is about to go viral." Henry's jaw tightened. He had expected people to be on his side. But the longer this went on, the more obvious it became. They weren't. And now? Now, he was stuck doubling down. Vanessa Carter, the mother Shaq had helped, had had enough. She stepped forward, her frustration bubbling over. "This is insane," she snapped. "Shaq did nothing but help me, and now you're acting like he robbed the place." Henry waved her off. "Ma'am, please." "Don't ma'am me," she fired back. "This is what happens every time, isn't it? A black man does something good and suddenly it's suspicious? Suddenly he's the problem?" Mitchell exhaled loudly. "Look, I understand your frustration, but this isn't about race." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Oh, really? Then what is it about?" Mitchell didn't answer, because there was no other answer. Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he simply stood there, at his full 7 feet 1 inch stature, his presence alone speaking louder than any argument. And it hit Henry then, really hit him. He wasn't just messing with some random guy. He was standing in front of a global icon, a 4-time NBA champion, a Hall of Famer, a man who had built an empire beyond basketball, known for his kindness, his generosity, his larger-than-life presence. And right now, he was looking directly at Henry, as if he was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Henry shifted under the weight of that gaze. For the first time, he felt small. Mitchell cleared his throat, trying to take control again. "Sir," he said, one last time, "I need you to step out of the store." Shaq finally moved. Not to leave, but to take a single step forward. And suddenly, the energy shifted again. Not because Shaq was threatening, not because he was aggressive, but because his very presence, his sheer size, his confidence, his unwillingness to be pushed around, was more power than Mitchell had ever had in his entire life. Shaq leaned down just slightly, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone. "You know what the difference is between me and you?" Mitchell swallowed. "Sir, this isn't—" "The difference," Shaq continued, "is that you think this store belongs to you. That you get to decide who's welcome and who isn't. That you get to be the judge." Mitchell didn't speak. Shaq straightened again. "But the real truth?" He exhaled. "I could buy this whole place and fire both of you right now." Henry's face drained of color, because he knew, everyone knew, that it wasn't just an empty statement. Shaquille O'Neal had the money, the influence, the power. If he wanted, he could walk out of here, make a call, and have this store under new management by morning. And Henry? Henry would be gone. For the first time, he felt the same fear he had so easily thrown onto other people. And he didn't like it. Shaq turned back toward the exit. He had already won, without ever needing to throw a punch, without ever needing to yell. He had won by refusing to be small. As he walked toward the automatic doors, Vanessa and her kids hurried to follow him. A few customers gave him nods of respect, some even clapping lightly. But before stepping outside, Shaq paused. He glanced back over his shoulder, locking eyes with Henry one last time. And then, with a small smirk, he said 5 words that sealed it. "Better luck next time, Henry." Then, he was gone. And Henry had never felt smaller. The doors of Miller's Fresh Market slid shut behind Shaquille O'Neal, but the tension inside the store didn't fade. Customers were still buzzing, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others clutching their phones, scrolling through the viral video that was already spreading. The whispers, the side glances, the growing discomfort in the air. It was far from over. And at Register 6, near the cold beverages section, one man had been watching everything. Dressed in dark jeans, a navy polo, and a simple wristwatch, the man had blended in with the regular shoppers. No name tag, no store uniform, nothing that suggested he was anything more than a customer. But his eyes had been sharp. His name was Daniel Carter, and he wasn't just any shopper. He was the regional manager of the entire grocery chain. And now, he was furious. Daniel stepped forward, his voice cool but authoritative. What exactly just happened here? Henry Lawson, still standing at his register, stiffened. He recognized that voice. He had only met Daniel once before, months ago, during an unannounced store inspection. And now, of all times, he was here? Henry felt his stomach twist, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, quickly calculating how to spin the situation. Just a misunderstanding, Henry said smoothly, forcing a casual smile. One of our policies was questioned, and it escalated a little. Daniel's expression didn't change. Escalated how? Henry shrugged. A large, unverified purchase. I followed procedure, asked for ID, and things got tense. Mitchell, the security officer still lingering near the registers, shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's gaze flicked toward him. Mitchell, is that what happened? Mitchell hesitated. He could feel the weight of the moment. He had assumed Henry was telling the truth when he arrived. He had assumed Shaq was being difficult. He had assumed the situation was something it wasn't. But now? Now he was seeing things differently. I was called in for a disturbance, Mitchell admitted. But, from what I actually saw, Mr. O'Neal wasn't aggressive. He was calm. Daniel's brows lifted. And yet, you asked him to leave? Mitchell swallowed. Henry made it seem like he was causing a major issue. Daniel turned back to Henry, who was now visibly sweating. You made it seem like Shaquille O'Neal, a man who has donated millions to charities, who has built schools for underprivileged kids, who has never needed to scam anyone, was committing fraud over a bag of groceries. Henry's face burned. But before he could finish, a voice from the crowd cut through the store. That's not what happened at all, a woman near the produce aisle said, stepping forward. Others started nodding. I saw the whole thing, a man by the self-checkout added. Shaq just paid for that lady's groceries. That's it. No argument, no trouble, until Henry started making it one. Henry whipped his head around, glaring at the customers who were now turning against him. Yeah, another woman near the floral section chimed in. He treated Shaq like a criminal for no reason, and when that woman, Vanessa, tried to defend him, Henry ignored her. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned back to Henry. So let me get this straight, Daniel said, his voice eerily calm. You saw Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most recognizable athletes in history, do something generous. And your first instinct was that he must have been scamming the store? Henry felt his pulse spike. That's not what Daniel cut him off. Then explain why you called security. Henry's mouth opened, then closed. Because what could he say? That it just didn't look right to him? That he didn't believe someone like Shaq could do something kind without an ulterior motive? That he saw a tall black man spending money and immediately felt the need to police it? There was nothing he could say that wouldn't expose what he already knew. He had made a mistake. Mitchell, the security officer, exhaled heavily. He wasn't proud of it, but he had let himself be used. Henry had fed him a story, and Mitchell had followed orders without questioning what was actually happening. And now he had helped escalate a situation that never should have happened in the first place. Mitchell turned toward Daniel. Look, I shouldn't have stepped in the way I did. I should have asked more questions first. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Then, after a long beat, he nodded. Noted. Henry, seeing Mitchell backing off, panicked. This is ridiculous, Henry snapped. I was just following store policy. If I can't question large purchases, then what's the point of having security at all? Daniel's eyes narrowed. You weren't questioning the purchase, Henry. Henry scoffed. Then what was I doing? Daniel's voice was like steel. You were questioning the person who made it. Henry froze, because Daniel had just said it out loud. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Daniel took a slow breath. You've been working here for over a decade, he said, and you still don't get it. Henry folded his arms, defensive. Get what? That this store isn't yours to police, Daniel said simply. You don't get to decide who's suspicious based on a feeling. You don't get to rewrite the rules when the customer doesn't look the way you expect. Henry's fists clenched at his sides. So what? Are you gonna fire me? Daniel didn't blink. Oh, you're absolutely fired. Henry's stomach dropped, but Daniel wasn't done. This isn't just about you, Daniel continued. It's about what you represent. It's about the fact that people like you make honest customers feel unsafe. That someone can walk in here, pay for groceries, and still get treated like a problem. Henry felt his throat tighten. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And as he looked around, he realized no one was on his side. Daniel pulled out his phone. You're officially terminated, he said, pressing a few buttons on the screen. Your access to the system is revoked. Turn in your name badge and leave the premises. Henry's face burned with humiliation. He wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, wanted to say something that would make him feel like he hadn't just lost everything in a single afternoon. But there was nothing left to say. Slowly, he unclipped his name badge, tossing it onto the counter. Then, without another word, he grabbed his coat and stormed toward the exit. As soon as the doors closed behind Henry, the store felt different. People breathed easier. The tension that had been coiling in the air for the last hour finally released. Daniel looked around the store, then at Mitchell. Do better next time, he said simply. Mitchell nodded stiffly, understanding exactly what that meant. Daniel let out a long breath, glancing at the time. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out his phone again, this time dialing a number. After 2 rings, someone picked up. Shaq, Daniel said, stepping toward the exit. Yeah, I saw everything. Let's talk. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The moment Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of Miller's Fresh Market, the storm had already begun. He could feel it in the air, a tension that wasn't going to disappear just because the incident was over. People were still inside talking. Others were outside, texting, checking their notifications, shaking their heads in disbelief. And somewhere, beyond the walls of the store, the internet had caught fire. Because while Shaq had been standing his ground, while Henry had been doubling down on his mistake, and while Daniel Carter had been watching everything unfold, a teenage boy named Jordan had been recording. And now the whole world was watching. Jordan Williams was 16 years old and obsessed with 2 things: basketball and social media. So, when he had seen Shaq walk into the store earlier, his first instinct had been to pull out his phone and start recording. But what started as a casual fan moment had turned into something else entirely. Jordan had captured everything. Henry's growing hostility, Officer Mitchell stepping in, Vanessa trying to defend Shaq, the moment security was called for a man who had done nothing but pay for someone's groceries. And the second Shaq walked out of the store, Jordan hit post. It didn't take long. Within minutes, Jordan's video had thousands of views. Within an hour, it was on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And by the time Jordan checked his phone again, his notifications were out of control. The internet had officially exploded. NBA fan 23. Ain't no way a cashier called security on Shaquille O'Neal for paying for groceries. This country is wild. Justice matters. This is why we talk about systemic bias. A black man does something kind, and it's immediately treated as suspicious. Wake up, people. Hoops Central. Shaq built entire schools, paid off student loans, donated millions, and this is how people still see him. News now. Viral video shows store cashier calling security on NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal for helping a struggling mother. The public demands answers. And then, the hashtag started trending. Anar let Shaq pay. Anar racism at the register. Do better Miller, fresh at first, the corporate office of Miller's Fresh Market, had no idea what was happening. But then the phone calls started, and the emails, and the thousands of furious comments flooding their social media pages. By the time their PR team realized the extent of the damage, it was too late. That night, local news stations ran the headline: Shaquille O'Neal questioned by store employee after paying for family's groceries, outrage spreads. Journalists analyzed the video frame by frame, breaking down Henry's reactions, Mitchell's actions, and Shaq's calm but powerful stance. News anchors debated the deeper implications. Why is kindness seen as a red flag when it comes from a black man? Would this situation have played out the same if Shaq was a white celebrity? This isn't just about Shaq. It's about who gets the benefit of the doubt in America. Even national outlets like CNN, ESPN, and Good Morning America picked up the story. And Miller's Fresh Market? Their stock was plummeting. Inside the headquarters of Miller's Fresh Market, the executive team was in full-blown crisis mode. Their CEO, Martin Reynolds, sat at the head of a conference table, his phone buzzing relentlessly. "This is a nightmare," one of the PR managers muttered, scrolling through Twitter. "They're calling for boycotts." Martin exhaled sharply. "Get me a statement. Now." 5 minutes later, the official Miller's Fresh Market Twitter page posted this. "We are aware of the incident involving Shaquille O'Neal at one of our locations. We take this matter seriously and are conducting an internal review. We do not condone discrimination in any form." The reaction? Pure outrage. "Real talk, Pat. Conducting an internal review. We're hoping this blows over in a few days. No justice. No peace. So no actual apology. Got it. NBA fan club. Shaq deserves better. And so does every other person who gets treated like this daily." The company's stock value dropped another 5% overnight. And the pressure kept building. While the internet raged, Shaq stayed quiet. He wasn't the type to rant online. He wasn't the type to call for boycotts. But he also wasn't the type to let things slide. The next morning, Shaq sat in a sleek black chair inside an ESPN studio, preparing for an exclusive live interview. Across from him sat host Rachel Monroe, her expression serious. The cameras rolled. "Shaq," Rachel started, "the world has seen the video. Everyone is talking about it. What do you want to say?" Shaq leaned forward slightly. His deep voice was calm, steady, but with weight behind it. "I want to say that this ain't about me." Rachel blinked, surprised. "It's not?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, I'm good. I got money, I got fame. But what about the people who go through this every day? What about the people who don't have a camera rolling when they get treated like they don't belong?" Rachel nodded, letting his words settle. Shaq continued, his gaze locked on the camera. "That's what this is about. I'm not mad, I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed. Because this happens too much. And I hope this makes people think before they judge someone just for existing in a space they didn't expect them to be in." The clip of his response was retweeted over 1 million times in under 6 hours. Under immense public pressure, Miller's Fresh Market finally caved. A second statement was released. "We sincerely apologize to Shaquille O'Neal and our customers for the unacceptable actions of our employee. The cashier involved has been terminated, and we are implementing new training policies to prevent incidents like this in the future." It was too late. The damage was done. Their sales dropped. Their reputation was permanently scarred. And meanwhile, Shaq kept moving forward. A few days later, Shaq was at a different grocery store. A mother stood at the checkout, counting her cash, hesitant about what she could afford. Shaq, standing nearby, stepped forward, reaching for his card. The cashier, a young black woman in her 20s, looked up, smiled, and nodded. Shaq tapped his card. And this time, no one stopped him. Inside Miller's Fresh Market, the tension hadn't faded. Shaquille O'Neal may have walked out, but his presence still lingered in the air. The store was no longer just a store. It was a crime scene of judgment, a reflection of a much bigger issue that had just played out in front of too many witnesses. And at the center of it all, Henry Lawson, the man who had started it, the man who had escalated it, the man who still didn't see what he had done wrong. But Daniel Carter did. And now, he wanted answers. Daniel stood just a few feet away from Henry, arms crossed, face unreadable. The weight of his silence alone was enough to make Henry's throat dry. "So," Daniel said finally, his voice measured, "you want to tell me exactly what just happened here?" Henry straightened his back, trying to look unaffected. "I was doing my job." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Your job?" Henry nodded quickly. "Yes, I saw an unusual transaction. I followed store policy and I called security. That's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? Daniel studied him for a long moment. You sure that's all it was? Henry exhaled sharply. Look, I get it. Everyone's mad. Everyone thinks I overreacted. But I was just trying to protect the store from fraud. Daniel's jaw clenched. Fraud? Yes, Henry said, latching onto his excuse like a lifeline. I mean, think about it. Who just steps in and pays for someone's groceries? Who does that? It was suspicious. A scoff came from behind them. Vanessa. She had been silent until now, but her patience had just run out. That's what this is about, she snapped. You thought it was suspicious that someone helped me? Henry turned slightly but wouldn't meet her eyes. Vanessa shook her head, her voice trembling. You think that's a normal thought? That when someone is kind, your first instinct is that they must be up to something? Henry stayed quiet. Vanessa's hands clenched at her sides. You didn't see fraud. You saw a black man paying for a white woman's groceries, and you didn't like it. Henry stiffened. That's exactly what happened, she snapped. Her two boys, Liam and Noah, stood beside her, confused and watching. Liam, the older one, finally spoke up. Mom, why did they get mad at him? Vanessa's breath hitched. She glanced at her son, her heart breaking a little at the question. Because how was she supposed to explain to an 8-year-old what had just happened? How was she supposed to tell him that the world sometimes saw people like Shaq as a problem before they ever got the chance to prove otherwise? Henry ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of too many eyes on him. This is being blown out of proportion, he muttered. Daniel's brows lifted. Blown out of proportion? Yes, Henry snapped, his frustration spilling over. You all are acting like I did something evil when all I did was follow protocol. It's not my fault people get so damn sensitive about everything these days. There it was, the final defense. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of his mistake. Just a frustrated deflection, blaming everyone else for calling him out. Daniel shook his head slowly. You don't get it, he said. Henry scoffed. What don't I get? Daniel took a step forward, lowering his voice. That your instincts were wrong. Henry opened his mouth, but Daniel cut him off. You say you followed protocol, but let's break this down, Daniel said. Did you call security when Shaq walked into the store? Number, did you call security when he picked up his own groceries? Number, Henry shifted uncomfortably. But the second he paid for someone else, Daniel continued, you decided he was a threat. Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel didn't stop. You saw a man, who, by the way, could buy this entire store and never notice the money missing, do something kind. And your first thought was, this doesn't make sense. He let that sink in for a second. Henry swallowed hard. Daniel's voice dropped lower, more direct, more final. And if you don't see the problem with that, then you are the problem. Meanwhile, outside the store, Shaq stood near his car, leaning against the door, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't calling lawyers, wasn't ranting to the press. He was just standing there staring at the pavement, lost in thought. Because this wasn't new to him. This wasn't a surprise. This wasn't some shocking moment that shook his worldview. It was just tiring. Tiring to know that even after everything he had accomplished, everything he had given back to communities, everything he had done to be a good man, this could still happen to him. That his kindness could still be questioned. That he could still be seen as a problem in places he had every right to be in. The doors to the store slid open. Vanessa stepped outside with her kids, her face still flushed with anger. She spotted Shaq, exhaled, and walked toward him. Liam, still confused, tugged at her sleeve. Mom, was that man mad because Shaq is tall? Vanessa's heart squeezed in her chest. She forced a small smile, kneeling so she could look Liam in the eyes. No, baby, it wasn't about that. Liam frowned. Then what was it about? Vanessa hesitated. Shaq, hearing the conversation, finally spoke. He crouched slightly so he was at eye level with Liam. You ever been at school, Shaq said, and done something good, but someone still got mad at you? Liam nodded. Yeah, that happens sometimes. Shaq gave a small smile. That's kind of what happened today. Liam looked up at him, still thinking. But why? Shaq exhaled slowly, then patted the kid's shoulder. You'll understand when you're older. Liam nodded, but he didn't really get it. And that's what made it hurt the most. Because one day, he would understand. And that day would change him forever. Vanessa turned to Shaq, her expression softening. I'm sorry this happened, she said quietly. Shaq shook his head. Ain't your fault. Vanessa swallowed hard. Still. Thank you, Shaq gave her a nod. You take care of those boys. Vanessa smiled. I will. She took Liam and Noah's hands, walking toward their car. Shaq watched them go. Then finally he sighed, pulled out his keys, and got into his own car. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Shaq opened it. Daniel Carter. We need to talk. Shaq's jaw tightened. Because this wasn't over yet. The tension inside Miller's Fresh Market was suffocating. Henry Lawson stood rigid behind his register, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He had always thought of himself as untouchable in this store, a longtime employee, someone who knew how things worked. But now he was being stared down by Daniel Carter, the regional manager who had just watched him make the worst mistake of his career, and there was no getting out of it. Daniel's voice was low, controlled, but final. You're fired. The words hit Henry like a brick. His head snapped up. What? You heard me, Daniel said, his face unreadable. Turn in your name tag and leave. Henry felt heat rising in his face. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had been here for years. He knew the rules. How was he being fired over one customer? This is ridiculous, Henry muttered. All this over what? Some misunderstanding? I was just doing my job. No, Daniel cut in sharply. You weren't. The weight in his voice made Henry shut up. This wasn't about store policy, Daniel continued. This wasn't about a payment verification. It was about who was making the payment. Henry's throat tightened. That's not fair. Daniel stepped forward, his expression unreadable. You know what's not fair, Henry? A man walks in, does something kind, and instead of being thanked, he gets treated like a criminal. Henry opened his mouth, but Daniel held up a hand. Stop. Just stop. His voice was exhausted now, but firm. For the first time, Henry actually looked around. At the customers still watching him. At the employees who refused to make eye contact. At Mitchell, the security officer, whose face was set in quiet shame. The truth was staring him in the face, and there was no running from it now. Without another word, Henry ripped his name tag off, tossed it onto the counter, and turned toward the exit. He didn't look back, and no one stopped him. As the automatic doors slid shut behind Henry, Daniel let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. Well, he muttered, that's done. But before he could say anything else, a deep voice cut through the tension. Not yet. Daniel turned and found Shaq standing in the doorway. His broad frame filled the space, his face unreadable. Daniel frowned. Shaq, You're making this about one guy, Shaq interrupted, his voice calm but firm. And that's the problem. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? Shaq stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. Henry's gone. Fine. But that doesn't fix the real issue, he said. Because Henry's not the only one who thinks like that. He's just the one who got caught today. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Shaq let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. How many other stores have a Henry working behind the counter? How many other people get treated like I did, but they don't have cameras on them? How many don't get the benefit of the doubt? Daniel exhaled slowly. Because he knew Shaq was right. Firing Henry was easy, but fixing the mindset that let Henry think he could act like that in the first place. That was the real challenge. Daniel folded his arms. What are you suggesting? Shaq didn't hesitate. Your company needs to do better. Bias training. Real policies in place that keep this from happening again. Not just here, in every store you run. Daniel's jaw tightened. It wasn't that he disagreed. He had just never been forced to think about it like this. Shaq watched him, then added, Or, You can keep pretending this was just one bad employee and wait for the next video to go viral. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple, because Shaq had a point, and it wasn't just about saving face anymore. It was about doing the right thing. Finally, after a long pause, Daniel nodded. All right, we'll make changes. Real ones. Shaq gave a small nod. Good. Daniel pulled out his phone. I'll call corporate. We'll put new policies in place. Not just bias training, but actual consequences if something like this happens again. Shaq didn't say anything at first. Then finally he nodded. Because this was bigger than him. As Daniel walked away, already making calls, the store slowly returned to motion. Cash registers beeped. Employees whispered. Customers started checking out again. And Shaq? He turned to leave. But before he could step out, a voice hesitated behind him. Mr. O'Neal. Shaq turned. Officer Brad Mitchell stood there, shifting awkwardly. For the first time that day, Mitchell looked uncomfortable. Not because he had been caught, but because he had just realized how badly he had misread the situation. Mitchell cleared his throat. I just wanted to say I was wrong. Shaq didn't say anything. Mitchell swallowed. I made a call based on what I thought was right at the time, but I should have looked at what was actually happening. Shaq exhaled slowly. Yeah, you should have. Mitchell nodded, his jaw tightening. Then after a long pause, he added, I'm sorry. Was it genuine? Was it just to save face? Shaq wasn't sure. But he had been in too many moments like this before. And at the end of the day, apologies didn't matter if nothing changed after them. Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Mitchell, then simply said, Make sure it doesn't happen again. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Mitchell watched him go. And for the first time, he wondered if he would ever be the same after this moment. By the time Shaq stepped into his car, he could already see his phone blowing up with messages. The video had spread. The world had reacted. But for Shaq, this wasn't about one viral moment. It was about what happened next. Because moments fade. Lessons stick. And now it was up to people like Daniel and Mitchell to prove that they had learned one. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. What had started as one moment inside a grocery store had exploded into a national conversation. The video of the incident, captured by a teenage bystander, had now been viewed millions of times. It wasn't just a trending topic on social media. It was on morning news shows, podcasts, and national debates. The clip had become symbolic, a real-world example of what many people had been saying for years. Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet assumption that a black man with money must be doing something wrong. And now people were finally paying attention. News anchors dissected the moment, playing and replaying the footage. CNN. Why did a simple act of kindness turn into a confrontation? NBC. Shaquille O'Neal's grocery store incident reignites discussions on racial bias in everyday spaces. ESPN. Shaq has spent years giving back. So why was his generosity questioned? Talk show hosts weighed in, celebrities posted statements, and the public? The public wasn't letting it go. Shaq had kept quiet about the situation, until now. Seated in a TV studio, across from well-known journalist Alyssa Grant, he finally addressed the world. Alyssa leaned forward. Shaq, the world saw what happened to you. What do you want to say about it? Shaq's deep voice was measured, thoughtful. I want to say this wasn't about me. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. It wasn't? Shaq shook his head. Nah, look, I got money, I got fame. I'll be fine. But what about the people this happens to every day? The people who don't have cameras rolling? Who don't have a platform? That's who I'm thinking about. Alyssa nodded, letting his words settle. Shaq exhaled. This ain't new. It's just caught on tape this time. The clip of his response was retweeted over 1 million times in under 6 hours. But it wasn't just talk. Because Shaq was about to turn this moment into something bigger. At the end of the interview, Shaq made an announcement that no one saw coming. I talked to some people, Shaq said. And we're starting something new. He looked into the camera. I'm partnering with grocery stores across the country to help struggling families get the food they need. No questions, no judgment, just help. The audience applauded instantly. Alyssa blinked. Wait, you're personally funding this? Shaq shrugged. Of course. I ain't gonna sit around and just talk. I want to do something. And just like that, the story shifted. It wasn't just about what had happened to Shaq. It was about what he was doing to make sure no one else had to go through it. The news of Shaq's initiative spread fast, and soon, a familiar face was invited onto a morning talk show. Vanessa Carter, the single mother Shaq had helped that day, sat on a plush chair, her hands clasped together, trying to keep her emotions in check. Beside her, her two sons, Liam and Noah. The host smiled. Vanessa, take us back to that moment. What was it like when Shaq stepped in to help you? Vanessa swallowed, then exhaled. I remember feeling embarrassed at first, she admitted, because I was standing there trying to figure out what I could afford. And then, out of nowhere, Shaq just took care of it. The host nodded. And then it escalated? Vanessa's lips pressed together. Yeah, because someone, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, didn't believe his kindness was real. The host leaned in. How did that make you feel? Vanessa looked at her sons for a moment before answering. It hurt, she admitted. Not just for me, but for my boys. Because they had to see that sometimes, no matter how good you are, people will still doubt you. And that's not a lesson I wanted them to learn so young. Noah, her youngest, clutched her arm, sensing the emotion in her voice. Liam, now a little older and a little wiser, spoke up. But Shaq didn't get mad, he said. He just stayed strong. The audience awed. Vanessa nodded. He did. And that's what stuck with me. The host smiled. And how are you doing now? Vanessa let out a small laugh. Better than ever. And you know what? Next time I see someone struggling in line, I'm paying it forward. The audience applauded. Because that's how change begins. One moment. One act of kindness. That keeps going. Days later, in a different city, at a different grocery store, Shaq walked down an aisle. He wasn't there for attention. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was just shopping. And then, he saw a mother with two kids at the register. He didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. The quiet counting of cash. The hesitant glances at the total. The familiar pause before putting something back. Shaq didn't think twice. He stepped forward, placed a hand on the counter and spoke. Put it back on the belt, he said. I got it. The mother turned, blinking in shock. What? Shaq just smiled. And then? Then something happened that hadn't happened before. No one questioned him. No cashier raised an eyebrow. No security was called. No one assumed the worst. The cashier, a young black woman in her 20s, just nodded and rang up the groceries. And when Shaq tapped his card, approved. As Shaq walked out of the store, he exhaled, staring up at the sky. Maybe the world wasn't perfect. Maybe moments like this didn't erase the past. But maybe, just maybe, this was proof that things could be different. And sometimes, all it took was one lesson that echoed. Some moments spark outrage. The real ones spark change. This isn't just a story about Shaq. It's about who gets questioned, who gets believed, and who gets to belong. The conversation has started, but what happens next is up to all of us. Because the next time kindness is mistaken for suspicion, who will stand up and who will stay silent?